soldiers who died in the fighting lie near the battle site. Fort Osage, just downriver from Lexington, was a rendezvous point for early-day Santa Fe Trail travelers. William Clark helped establish the fort in 1808. The same William Clark who just 2 years earlier had completed a history-making exploration of the Missouri and Columbia River basins with President Thomas Jefferson's young secretary, Meriwether Lewis. Fort Osage was built on a high bluff overlooking the Missouri River. It served as a military garrison and government-owned Indian trading post. It was the first outpost in the Louisiana Purchase, and it was that purchase which prompted the expedition of Lewis and Clark. It was called a factory fort, but it wasn't a manufacturing facility, which we today call a factory. It was part of a trade policy called a factory system, whereby George Sibley was appointed by the federal government to serve as the fort's factor. He would keep a very careful record of the dollar value of each exchange in the fort's trading post. It's said that Sibley also lavishly entertained Osage Indian chiefs and lovely princesses in their most colorful garments in his quarters here at the fort. Private traders felt they faced unfair competition from the government, so they lobbied Congress to have the factory system abolished at the fort, and they won. Fort Osage was closed and abandoned by 1827, 2 years after Sibley completed a federal survey of the Santa Fe Trail. As the starting points of the Santa Fe Trail spread upriver to Independence and Westport, the fort was all but forgotten. But today it's remembered as having played an important role in westward expansion. Fort Osage has been rebuilt on its original stone foundations. It's open to the public and is operated by the Jackson County, Missouri Parks and Recreation Department. The steamboat landings used by the Santa Fe traders have long since disappeared along the Missouri. They were located at Independence and Westport, a site near the present location of downtown Kansas City. If those early pioneers were alive today, they'd feel justly proud at viewing the city's impressive skyline. As Fort Osage was shutting down, the safety of westbound caravans became a major concern, so the government started setting up military forts and outposts on the frontier. The first was Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. It was one of the first military forts west of the Missouri River, and both the Santa Fe and Oregon trails came through here. Thousands of wagons packed full of freight, animals pulling with every ounce of muscle they could bear, and people already growing weary of hard traveling cut a deep swale into the earth as they trudged up a steep hillside from the Missouri River landing at Leavenworth. There's such a deep cut from years of use that in viewing the swale, one can still sense the presence of those early pioneers. Frontier traders picked up the first of several armed military escorts at Leavenworth and then headed west. The first escorts were foot soldiers. Later, dragoons who could fight on foot or on horseback were used. And finally, the cavalry. The soldiers were well equipped for long days on the trail. Their job was to protect the civilian wagon trains from Indian attack. Later, they escorted their own wagon trains as the Santa Fe Trail became an important transportation route for ferrying military supplies, personnel, and dependents to other forts and military outposts along the western frontier. This large bowl of land along Corral Creek at Fort Leavenworth was a staging area for the famous freight company of Russell, Majors, and Waddell. During its heyday, it was a massive activity as wagons were loaded and teams of oxen and mules were hitched up for the trip west. The Santa Fe Trail was mainly a trading route, with commercial goods being hauled in huge freight wagons. Military supplies were always needed on the trail, and traders sold a wide range of merchandise in Santa Fe, including domestic cotton goods, jewelry, and champagne. Their wagons were often sold also, and they were paid in highly prized Spanish coins, which were widely circulated throughout Missouri, making it one of the wealthiest states in the Union by the mid-1800s. As military operations grew along the trail, tough Army freight wagons formed long and short caravans, with ambulance wagons bounding back and forth, transporting sick and injured soldiers to post hospitals. Stagecoach companies used much of the trail to haul passengers, mail, and light freight. This coach was sometimes called a mud wagon because the canvas flaps did little to protect passengers from the clods of dirt and mud kicked up by horses' hooves. The Concorde was the more well-known and well-liked because not only did it protect passengers from stormy weather, but it also provided cover for them to defend themselves from attacks by Indians or bandits. Fort Leavenworth, where these wagons are on display, gives visitors the opportunity to see a variety of buildings which date from trail days, including the old post headquarters called the Rookery, built in 1832. Today, Fort Leavenworth is more than 160 years old. It's still an active military post, but welcomes outside visitors to its historic buildings and museum. In 1852, the government saw the need of establishing a second major military post in Kansas, 130 miles west of Fort Leavenworth. It was called Fort Riley. Like Leavenworth, Fort Riley became an important military post in protecting the trade route of the Santa Fe Trail. As more and more forts were established along the frontier, military roads started connecting with the Santa Fe Trail and became major contributors to this huge trading route which headed in a generally southwesterly direction out of Fort Leavenworth. In the 1860s, traders and soldiers shared this part of the trail with busy stagecoaches pulling in and out of the Mahaffey House where passengers were being fed and fresh horses hitched up. The building still stands today near downtown Olathe, Kansas. After a full day's travel from the Missouri River, caravans spotted an elm tree standing tall in the prairie. With plenty of grass around and water from a spring, the Lone Elm Campground became a huge gathering place that first night for people traveling not only to Santa Fe, but also to Oregon. A few miles to the southwest, the Oregon Trail split off and headed toward the northwest, while the Santa Fe Trail continued its course toward New Mexico. The trail moved through the town of Lanesfield, where excited children would stand in the front yard of their small stone schoolhouse and wave to passing wagon trains. As the wagons continued their westward course, the prairie became thick with golden grass waving in the breeze. Pioneers described it as a sea of grass, sometimes growing as tall as a man. At Blackjack Creek, the trail entered an area where its course was determined by a couple of nearby rivers. It was often quite muddy through here because the ground held water like a sponge. During rainy weather, the trail through Blackjack was sometimes nearly impassable. So during wet weather, the slow trek to Santa Fe became even slower as the animals struggled to pull the heavy wagons through the mud. George Sibley came through here in 1825 when he surveyed the Santa Fe Trail. A stone marker commemorating his effort has been placed in the middle of a tract of virgin prairie. Today, a long stretch of U.S. Highway 56 follows the route of the Santa Fe Trail from Kansas City across southern Kansas to New Mexico. Stagecoaches provided important transportation links for the towns that grew up on the Santa Fe Trail. The ruins of stage stations like the Simmons House stand proudly silent while the world around them changes. Some communities like Burlingame, Kansas, grew up with the Santa Fe Trail. The trail came right up Burlingame's Main Street, and today this quiet farming community reflects an unwavering spirit and pride found among nearly all the towns along the route. Some towns simply vanished, leaving little historical record behind. The ruins of the Havana stage station are all that remain of one such community. The caravans crossed many creeks and rivers, and one was Dragoon Creek. When creeks and rivers were swollen from heavy rains, the crossings were tough and dangerous. In a nearby field, a lone grave, the grave of Private Samuel Hunt, a Kentucky dragoon who died in 1835, a mute reminder that death along the trail was often quick and unexpected. The wagons crossed the Neosho River into Council Grove. It was not only one of the most lush sites on the trail, but also one of the most important because of the hardwood trees growing along the river. From now on, wood was going to be scarce, and the trees offered caravans the last opportunity to stock up on hardwood for spare wagon parts. And the bustling town of Council Grove gave traders and emigrants the last chance to stock up on needed supplies. George Sibley gave the town its name in 1825 after signing a treaty with the Osage Indians under a large tree in the heart of town. Only the trunk of that great tree remains today. In later years, local merchants built excellent reputations and small fortunes from the Santa Fe trade. Among them was Seth Hayes, a descendant of Daniel Boone, and Malcolm Kahn. Both men opened stores here in 1858. The Last Chance store, built in 1857, was once the last place traders and pioneers could buy supplies before reaching Santa Fe. The store later became a post office and government trading post. The Kaw Indian Mission was built in 1851 to serve as a school for the Kaw Indian children. 3 years later, it became a school for white children. It also provided accommodations from time to time for some of the wealthier and more prominent trail travelers. The Santa Fe Trail had its share of eccentrics, and one of them lived in this cave on the edge of town. Giovanni Maria Augustini was an Italian nobleman who has been described as a religious mystic. He only lived in this cave a short time before asking the leader of a passing wagon train if he could accompany it to New Mexico. He was accepted, and Augustini walked the entire 550 miles to Las Vegas, New Mexico. His life ended tragically a few years later when he was murdered. Hermit's Cave is a quiet place to stop for a few moments and reflect on a man whose untimely death was as mysterious as his life. The caravans continued their southwesterly course out of Council Grove, starting across a wide expansion of prairie, where water would become more scarce and Indians would become more dangerous and unpredictable. For now, there would be plenty of small springs, like Lost Spring, to provide water for drinking and washing, and grass for grazing. And each new sunset brought a wagon train one day closer to the safety and fortunes of Santa Fe. As the wagon trains moved further into the plains, some campsites had to be guarded by soldiers because of the increased threat of Indian attack. One such site is marked by a well, which some historians believe was operated by Buffalo Bill Mathewson, who had a ranch near here. A young man by the name of William F. Cody worked for him for a short time and later also took the name Buffalo Bill. The well was located near the Cow Creek crossing, which took the Santa Fe Trail into hostile Indian country.